You're now watching Around the Horne, the weekly internationalist news update with author and historian Gerald Horne.
Today is April 23rd, 2025. Welcome everyone to the weekly series entitled Around the Horne, which is an internationalist news update with historian and Professor Gerald Horne. As we go around the horn. First, we want to ask you about the news related to Nvidia and Huawei. This past Monday, April 21st, Nvidia shares sank after Reuters reported Huawei is about to launch its new 910C AI chips designed to rival Nvidia's powerful H100S. Huawei's new chips arrived just days after the U.S. government banned Nvidia's China-specific H20 GPU line, designed to comply with trade restrictions. Nvidia stock slid around nearly 5.5%, extending last week's $230 billion market cap wipeout. J.P. Morgan now projects Nvidia could lose up to $16 billion in fiscal year 2025 alone. Dr. Horne, what is the significance of this news regarding Nvidia and Huawei, particularly as it relates to U.S.'s attempts to weaken China?
Well, the significance is embedded in that latter comment. It's important for our audience to recognize that we are in the foothills of two momentous developments. We'll speak primarily this evening about the first, which is that we're about to enter, if we have not already entered, a new international situation, a new world order, a new global correlation of forces, where China and its comrades in the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa plus, are surging ahead, while as Ursula von der Leyen, the head of the European Commission, the European Union, suggests that the, quote, West, quote, as we know it, no longer exists. This is of monumental significance. At the same time, in a trend that we addressed a bit last week and will address more in coming weeks, in the United States, perhaps not unrelated to that previous trend, we're in the foothills of fascism. That is to say, with the attempt by the Trump regime to send U.S. residents to a hellhole of a prison in El Salvador, with Mr. Trump promising to send, quote, homegrowns, unquote, to a similar fate, with next up in the Trump agenda is possibly denaturalization. That is to say, stripping U.S. citizens of their U.S. citizenship and forcing them either to go back to their ancestral homeland or perhaps also go to this hellhole of a prison in El Salvador. This is something we should take quite seriously. Now, I should offer the point, however, that in light of this financial crisis, which the United States has unleashed, not least in the United States itself, there may be an impact upon this latter trend. That is to say, many in the upper levels of the U.S. middle class may face the prospect of going bankrupt as a result of the United States unleashing this trade war with China. If you follow business news, for example, I'm sure you've seen the wary comments by leaders of small businesses. It has been suggested that thousands of small businesses may go bankrupt in coming weeks unless something is done about this trade deal. And this is a reflection of the fact that Mr. Trump suddenly has become more dovish with regard to talking about China. In fact, he's sitting by the phone like a lovesick teenager, awaiting a call from President Xi Jinping, but President Xi Jinping has decided to ghost him. And so this may signal that folks who may have voted for Mr. Trump will express disgust about his mangling of the U.S. economy and may decide to join the anti-Trump coalition. The downside there is, and I'm afraid to say, that irrespective of whether or not that latter prospect becomes reality, that is to say, folks in the upper level of the middle class abandoning Mr. Trump, it seems as if there will be no retreat on this attack on diversity, equity, and inclusion. That is to say, no retreat with regard to trying to undermine anti-racist efforts. That is the glue that helps to stick the forces in the Trump coalition together, particularly the working class elements in the Trump coalition, from the Euro-American working class and the folks in the upper middle class who feel that diversity, equity, inclusion circumscribes their opportunities. You should also know that you cannot begin to understand the politics of the United States without understanding class collaboration. If you want to get a glimpse of class collaboration, ask yourself why it is in the U.S. Civil War, 1861 to 1865, that many poor Euro-American workers fought to keep slavery, even though the existence of slavery was having gravitational downward pull on their working conditions and wages. And yet they fought to the death nonetheless. And so class collaboration inheres in settler colonialism. And sadly, many of our friends on the left have yet to recognize this. Now, back to the essence of the matter, which is this trade fiasco with China in particular. The audience should recognize that China has escalatory dominance with regard to this relationship. It can continue to ratchet up the pressure with regard to canceling deals with Boeing, with regard to canceling deals concerning rare earths, which are necessary for the technological society. Whereas the United States supposedly is on an escalation ladder. They can continue to pressure nations all over the world to boycott China. And if you boycott China, you may endure or may enjoy zero tariffs. If you don't boycott China, of course, the sky is the limit with regard to China. The problem is that many of these third countries are not willing to follow these so-called secondary sanctions. And with regard to the military, as we may have indicated before, the much besieged head of the U.S. military, Pete Hegseth, has suggested that in every war game in which the United States is involved in a fictional fight with China, the United States loses. But I don't think we should rule out the possibility that there will be some sort of false flag operation concerning the rebel island of Taiwan off the southern coast of China, which China claims as its own, which could help to lure China and the United States into a more bellicose conflict. But with regard to the previous point concerning the United States at the mercy of China, you need to look no further than the fact that this deal that has been ratified for a Chinese firm to sell TikTok, the wildly famous social media app, is now in remission. It's not happening for various reasons. We see that Apple received a carve out with regard to escaping tariffs on its exports from China. Most Apple iPhones are made in China. We see as well, and this is extremely important, that just this week, the leaders of Walmart, Target, and Home Depot came to the White House and bit Mr. Trump's ear and told him that unless something was done with regard to this trade war, that within weeks there would be empty shelves, not only in their enterprises. Keep in mind that Walmart also sells groceries, but that these many more businesses could go bankrupt as a result. And so we see that there is also a flight in markets from all asset classes of the United States, not only the Treasury bonds, which helped to finance the United States government, and that helped Mr. Trump to make his first retreat some days ago from the sharper edges of this trade war. The fact that the United States has to pay more to borrow also ricochets down with regard to folks having to buy cars, having to pay more for their auto loans and pay more for their mortgage loans in order to buy a residence. Pay attention to the rise in the price of gold, and also pay attention to what's happening on the Shanghai Gold Exchange in China, because China is now working out deals whereby trade partners, instead of trading in the dollar, can trade in gold. And as we speak, we may be facing the most significant downturn in U.S. stock markets since, you guessed it, 1932, when the Great Depression was just attaining liftoff. Needless to say, this is causing quite a bit of hysteria amongst spokesmen of the U.S. ruling elite. Foremost amongst them is Tom Friedman of the New York Times. Recall that in the early stages of the Soviet Union, about a century ago, the muckraking journalist Lincoln Steffens went to Soviet Union and said, "I've seen the future and it works." Tom Friedman of the New York Times has been going to China steadily this year, and his line is, "I've seen the future and it's terrifying." That is to say that he feels that unless something is done, that this will be a very important monumental defeat for U.S. imperialism in its battle with China. And the audience should know that this will not be like the transition in the 1600s in Europe from Holland's ascendancy to England's ascendancy, or post-1945 with the United States ascendancy and England's decline. This is the rise not only of an Asian power, but of an Asian power ruled by a communist party, which brings us back to Huawei. I would suggest that for those who are interested in following the ups and downs, mostly ups, of this major Chinese corporation, that you take a peek at this book. The author's surname is DOU, House of Huawei, The Secret History of China's Most Powerful Company. And I think that if you peruse this book, you'll get an idea of why China's in the passing lane and why hysteria is ascending in Washington and on Wall Street.
Learn more about the rise of Huawei and how China's tech sector was supposed to be bankrupt, but instead the U.S. is now ironically dependent on China. Check out this interview from Inside China Business. Dr. Horne, as we go around the horn, we also want to ask you about elections in Australia and Canada. Early voting in Australia began yesterday, Tuesday, April 22nd, with Prime Minister Anthony Albanese's centre-left Labour Party holding a slim lead over the Conservative opposition coalition. And in Canada, after trailing the Conservatives for months, the Prime Minister Mark Carney-led Liberal Party could be on its way to secure a clear majority in the upcoming election. The Liberal Party is expected to secure a win with a projected 182 seats, which is enough for a 21-seat majority. This shift marks a major political comeback for the Liberal Party. Dr. Horne, with the upcoming elections in Canada on April 28th and in Australia on May 3rd, do you think these elections will provide any clues for the political situation in the U.S.?
It's possible, particularly Australia, which is quite close in many different ways to the United States of America. You need look no further than Hollywood stars, such as Nicole Kidman, for example, whose roots are in Australia are going back decades, Earl Flynn, whose roots are in Australia, in his case, Tasmania, an island off the southern coast of Australia, which deserves more attention than it has received of late. What's interesting about the Australian elections is that Peter Dutton, who is the Conservative challenger, is a former police officer, a very Trumpian. And as we will note momentarily with regard to Canada, he was expected to do quite well before Mr. Trump began to muck up the global economy. Now it's expected that on the May 3rd elections, he will not do so well. But Canada presents Exhibit A in this regard. And keep in mind that I'm speaking to you from Victoria, British Columbia. That is to say that before January 20th and Mr. Trump's inauguration, the so-called conservatives were 20 to 25 points ahead with regard to this election. That then Mr. Trump began to slap sanctions on tariffs on Canada. He began to talk about making Canada the 51st state, which does not go down very well. Listeners and viewers should ask themselves how and why it is that in 1776 that Canada did not join particularly Quebec and Nova Scotia, did not join the revolt against British rule that led to the foundation of the United States of America. And of course, in 2025, they say hell no with regard to joining the United States of America and giving up their socialized health care, giving up their aversion to having guns being circulated in universities and high schools, leading to mass shootings. And so this election in Canada in particular might have some sort of relevance to the trajectory of the United States of America. Because we know that the fascism to which I alluded a moment or two ago oftentimes has global reach and global ramifications. And therefore, we take quite seriously the fact that the Prime Minister of Italy, Prime Minister Meloni, has been making a steady number of visits to Washington, first to see Mr. Biden, and now to see Mr. Trump. She's quite close, we are told at least, to Elon Musk's first buddy. We also see that the neo-Nazi, or shall we say, Nazi-curious Alternative for Germany party came in number 2 in the German elections. We see as well, as we go around this small planet, that these right-wing forces are on the march. However, if they suffer a setback in Canada and in the United States and in Australia, both Canada and Australia, like the United States, being former US colonies, quite close, all part of the so-called Five Eyes coalition. That's this diabolical coalition that shares intelligence, and that includes Britain and New Zealand, and is involved in a lot of dirty work and hanky-panky and dirty tricks all over the world. If the right wing is defeated in Canada and Australia, it may hold out hopeful signs for the United States of America.
Dr. Horne, as we go around the horn, we also want to ask you a couple of questions about the Congo. It was reported on April 19th, 2025, that the former Congolese President Joseph Kabila, accused by the government of supporting rebels in the country's east, returned to Congo from self-imposed exile, arriving in rebel-held Goma City. In response, the government suspended the political party of former President Kabila and ordered the seizure of his assets, accusing the 53-year-old of high treason over alleged ties to the Rwandan-backed M23 rebel group. In addition, it was reported on April 17, 2025, that the prominent Trump supporter Eric Prince and founder of Blackwater reached a deal with Democratic Republic of Congo to secure its mines and exploit Congo's vast mineral wealth. Dr. Horne, what is your analysis of everything going on in the Congo?
Well, I think one of the reasons why Mr. Kabila decided to come back from South Africa and exile to his homeland is precisely because of what's happening with regard to minerals and mineral-rich Congo. That is to say, before his arrival, we had been told that the Tshisekedi regime in power in Kinshasa had been negotiating with the Trump administration in a kind of security for minerals deal. That is to say that the United States would either boost folks like Eric Prince and his mercenary forces to try to confront the so-called M23 rebels in exchange for the United States having dibs concerning minerals. I think that that deal might not necessarily pan out, not least because the M23 rebels have proceeded far down the path, and I'm not sure if they can be subdued by Mr. Prince and his mercenaries. It might require the U.S. military itself, and I don't think that Washington nor Mr. Trump have the stomach to put U.S. forces on the ground in Congo and facing an uncertain fate. I think that our audience, and particularly the international community and the progressive community, should be looking more to these mediation efforts, one led by the African Union and another led by certain Arab forces, because that holds out the prospect for a more desirable outcome than these kinds of murky operations by Eric Prince, who, as you know, has a reputation that's not necessarily stellar.
Dr. Horne, as we go around the horn, we also want to talk to you about Burkina Faso. It was reported earlier this month that President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso has narrowly escaped yet another attempt on his life. Details surrounding the assassination attempt remain scarce, but preliminary reports suggest that unidentified assailants targeted the president during a routine movement in the capital. Security forces quickly intervened, thwarting the attack and ensuring Traoré's safety. Dr. Horne, what is your reaction to this news of yet another attempt on President Traoré's life?
Yet another attempt indeed. It's not the first, and I'm afraid to say it may not be the last. Keep in mind that the regime in Ouagadougou is facing a quite substantial armed resistance led by so-called Islamic fundamentalists, said to be backed, you guessed it, by the United Arab Emirates and other Gulf Arab forces. Keep in mind as well that there's a lot of upset in the North Atlantic bloc with the regime in Burkina Faso, because they've been in the vanguard and knocking together this bloc that includes Mali and Niger. This region and the Association of Sahel States is mineral wealthy. Keep in mind as well that in Mali in particular, they've been playing hardball with the North Atlantic mineral interests, detaining executives from these companies and not releasing them until and unless they sign new contracts that make sure that these African nations receive a higher percentage of the wealth. That is to say that they're not necessarily just going to be subject to extraction of their resources. Something to watch, needless to say, is the role of France. On the one hand, you see that France is not necessarily having good relations with Algeria, its former colony, which it colonized back in about 1830. And Algeria is a force to be reckoned with. Those who follow the Palestinian question in the United Nations know that the Algerians have been in the forefront of denouncing Israeli aggression in Gaza, for example. But on the other hand, Algeria does not necessarily have ideal relations with Mali in particular. And many of us have been concerned that this could be used to the detriment of the Sahel states. The North Atlantic countries are also upset with the fact that Burkina Faso is exercising positive influence in Accra, Ghana, the inaugurated and installed regime of John Mahama. And Accra, Ghana has been seen as a site historically for U.S. foul play, going back to the overthrow of founding father Kwame Nkrumah in 1966. And I should end finally by saying that the fact that the Sahel states are seeking to pull out of ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, spearheaded by Nigeria, also has not won them plaudits in the North Atlantic countries. So once again, we have to encourage our friends in Ouagadougou to draw upon the expertise of Cuban comrades concerning the protection of elected officials, protection of leaders, because given the strength of these so-called Islamic fundamentalists in that part of Africa, these kinds of assassination attempts will not be going away anytime soon.
Dr. Horne, as we go around the horn, we also want to talk to you about Côte d'Ivoire, the Ivory Coast. On April 18th, it was reported that Tidjane Thiam, a former Credit Suisse CEO, won a near unanimous vote to represent the Democratic Party of Ivory Coast in an upcoming presidential election. It was further reported that Thiam won 99.5% of the vote and ran unopposed for the nomination. It is not yet known who will run against him, but the current president, Alassane Ouattara, has indicated that he may run again. Ouattara won in 2020 after a disputed election left dozens dead and opposition candidates boycotted the election. Dr. Horne, as the election in the Ivory Coast is scheduled for October 2025, what is your reaction to this news about Tidjane Thiam?
Well, first of all, Mr. Ouattara is certainly France's man. That is to say, there's a story, which I assume is not apocryphal, that in his office there is a trap door that leads directly through an underground passageway to the French embassy that he can retreat to in case Ivorians with pitchforks materialize at his doorstep. On the other hand, his opponent that has just been mentioned, a former leader of the fabulously profitable and wealthy Swiss firm Credit Suisse, is no prize as far as the progressive and radical movement in West Africa is concerned. Indeed, this race, as it's now standing, and I say it's now standing because there's some question as to whether or not Mr. Thiam, the former leader of Credit Suisse, will be disqualified and will not be allowed to run. But assuming he is allowed to run, it will turn out to be a race, in a sense, between France's man, speaking of Mr. Ouattara, who coincidentally enough is married to a French woman, and the United States man, Mr. Thiam, the former leader of Credit Suisse, who coincidentally enough is married to a Black American woman. And so, unfortunately, I'm not sure if this race with those two candidates will bring the kind of equity and progressivism that the masses of Côte d'Ivoire so richly deserve. And of course, I should also mention that Côte d'Ivoire is not necessarily a friend of the neighboring Sahel states, speaking of Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger. And that's one of the many reasons why progressive candidates in their attempts to break into this presidential race thus far have been squashed, squelched, and blocked.
Dr. Horne, as we go around the horn, we also want to talk to you about reports from April 19th that 2 Japanese naval ships docked Saturday at Cambodia's Ream Naval Base. The Ream Naval Base recently completed a major Chinese-funded upgrade, which has heightened U.S. concerns that it will be used as a strategic outpost for China's Navy in the Gulf of Thailand. At the same time, Tokyo has developed increasingly close ties with Cambodia in recent years, seeking to offset China's influence in the region, and Cambodia invited Japan to make the renovated port's first port call, which has widely been seen as an attempt to allay Washington's concerns. But Dr. Horne, do you think the fact that Japanese naval ships make the naval port's first port call should allay Washington's concerns?
Not necessarily. And let me clarify a point made last week, prompted by one of our many intelligence audience members. It was noted that I may have left the impression that the conflict between China and Vietnam some decades ago was sparked by the fact that the Vietnamese Communist Party and the socialist regime was cracking down on business elements, many of whom were of Chinese ancestry. And as the audience member correctly pointed out, the fact is that the conflict between Vietnam and China stemmed in no small measure from the fact that it was Vietnam that intervened in neighboring Cambodia some decades ago to help to dislodge the genocidal, murderous Khmer Rouge regime, which, by the way, happened to be backed by the People's Republic of China, and in a cynical maneuver that led to China and the United States collaborating against Vietnam for a number of years, punishing it for having the gumption to overthrow a murderous genocidal regime. Now, I'm unfortunately and sadly aware of this because in late 1979, I was part of an international delegation that visited Cambodia, or Kampuchea, as it was then called by some, after the Vietnamese had overthrown the Khmer Rouge. We actually also went to Hanoi and met with the Communist Party leadership and met with the leaders of the state and government and party. And what we heard, quite frankly, was quite disturbing with regard to Chinese backing of the Khmer Rouge. And indeed, I trust and I hope that when President Xi Jinping visited Vietnam just a few days ago, that he may offer some sort of penance for the unfortunate backing of the Khmer Rouge in which the Chinese Communist Party was involved in. In any case, this visit of these Japanese vessels to Cambodia, I think it should not be ignored, but at the same time, I think it would be a mistake to overdetermine its significance. But in any case, I think we've reached the end of the road.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.